So much, Emmanuel, and thank you for sharing the session. Thanks for joining us today, both in person and online. It's actually quite exciting to finally get to do this talk at BDFI. I started working with the BDFI back in 2020, so during the pandemic, and then as a postdoctoral fellow, and now as a lecturer. And there have been various attempts to do this BDFI Introduces seminar for me over the last few years, and we've been thwarted every time, so we finally get to do it today. So thanks for being here. As Emmanuel already said, my name is Jessica Ogden. I'm a lecturer here at BDFI as well as in sociology here at the University of Bristol. I'm a sociologist as well as a web scientist, and today I'm here to talk to you about web archives and what I'm calling web futures in the making. So across several projects, my research looks at the many ways that both the past and the future of the web are shaped by the everyday activities and different actors and agendas who are working to archive the web for the future. So let's see if I can click two things at the same time here. So here's a quick overview of what I'm hoping to cover today. I'll start by briefly questioning the notion that the current web as a hypertext system is one that can be considered inevitable. And this really relates to what I would call a live discussion within the Bristol Digital Futures Institute, as well as within the Web Science Institute, where I was previously based at the University of Southampton, where a futures framing opens up the possibilities for thinking about the many different paths for technological development. So I'll then ground this thinking in a research agenda and a field of context that considers the ways that the World Wide Web has a memory problem and the ways in which various platforms and content that we interact with online are actually quite ephemeral, as well as knowing how web archiving has been framed as a so-called solution to this problem of ephemerality. And I'll say a bit more about what I mean by that. Then I'll pose three observations about how web archiving is a future-making practice and the significance or implications of these observations for thinking about the role of these massive data archives in the development of data-driven technologies and beyond. So, since this is a BDFI Introduces seminar, I thought I'd say a little bit more about my background. As Emmanuel has already mentioned, it is kind of coming from an interdisciplinary space. So I have a BA in anthropology, which I did at a very small liberal arts school in the US, before then coming to the UK to do an MSc in archaeological computing. That is the application of computational technologies to the field of archaeology, which then took me into 10 years working in commercial archaeology here in the UK. If you want to know more about that, I'm happy to share over coffee. After which I entered back into academia to do an PhD, so that's the 3+1 program in the web science program at the University of Southampton, which really was a truly interdisciplinary program. So I was based in both computer science and in sociology there. And that's where my research into web archives began, now nearly 10 years ago, which is also strange to think about. So to date, most of my research has concentrated on the everyday practice and politics of data more generally, but specifically web data as well. The infrastructure is used to collect and maintain that data, as well as the socio-technical methods needed to understand them as socio-technical phenomenon. And this research has been facilitated by a number of grant-funded projects and interdisciplinary collaborations with folks in computer science, information science, digital humanities, and sociology. So back to the task at hand. Here, I want to draw on work from some colleagues at the Web Science Institute from back in 2010. And in this article entitled, "Could the Web Be a Temporary Glitch?" Les Carr and colleagues outline an argument that this version of the web is one of many possible hypertext systems where it originally emerged from a very specific set of socio-technical circumstances and a specific set of actors at CERN. And that's not to say that the web hasn't changed over time. Clearly it has. And we see this through the discourse surrounding the platformization of the web, so-called Web 2.0, and the rise of social media online over time. And these changes continue with current discourses and technological development surrounding so-called Web 3 and decentralized web technologies, which have been framed by their advocates as a possible course correction for the platformization and the failings of the current web, which I'll say a little bit more about towards the end of the presentation. But ultimately, I'm taking a cue here from this article by Carr and colleagues that questions whether or not we need a futurology of the web to consider a range of possible webs and the different actors and agendas that are shaping them. So since launching in the early 1990s, the web clearly has fundamentally changed the ways that we organize and interact, communicate, consume, and produce culture, economic exchange, and more. But since the beginning, the web has had this memory problem. The many opportunities that the web brings, studies have shown that the longer things are online, the more likely they are to disappear, a problem commonly known in the field as link rot. Link rot can be caused by lots of reasons. For example, someone forgets to pay the domain subscription or a web address name. The web page gets moved somewhere else by the site maintainer or during an upgrade, or when someone deletes a post. And sometimes the website or content we're looking for is still there, but the content has changed or migrated in ways that no longer resembles what was there the last time we looked. And we call this content drift. But when it comes to science, this can be a real problem if we're interested in verifying or using the data from a scientific study, or confirming something that somebody said, or in tracking a particular issue, or perhaps a politician's position over time. So insert web archives. In response to this ephemeral and transient web since the 1990s, around the time that the web was invented, various national libraries and archives and other public institutions began archiving the public web in web archives. The most famous of these, and probably the biggest, is the Internet Archive Wayback Machine. And they've been archiving since, I think, 1996, supposedly, but I think it was actually 1999, but we won't quibble about that. But rather than me tell you more about the Internet Archive Wayback Machine, a couple of days ago, there was a broadcast on the Internet Archive by the CBS Sunday morning show in the US, so I thought I'd show a little clip.
The internet has changed our lives in so many ways, but sometimes it seems all that content is here today, gone tomorrow. Enter the Wayback Machine. David Poe takes us on a journey back in time.
David Samuel plays viola in a San Francisco string quartet, but he almost didn't make it into this country.
A Canadian citizen and therefore needed a work visa if I was coming to the United States, an artist visa.
That visa required special documentation.
I was tasked with finding old programs, articles, interviews, anything that could demonstrate that I had contributed significantly to the field.
Unfortunately, most of that stuff had disappeared from the internet over the years.
Somebody said, oh, you should check out the Internet Archive, the Wayback Machine.
The Wayback Machine is a time machine for the web.
Mark Graham is the Wayback Machine's director.
It does that by going and looking at web pages, hundreds of millions of them every single day right now, and stores them in our servers.
The Wayback Machine has been making backup copies of the World Wide Web since 1996, coming up on 900 billion web pages backed up. It's free and public. Start at archive.org. Now you can see what the New York Times looked like in 1996, or what Netflix looked like when it was a DVD by mail company, or what your own website looked like whenever. About 1 million people a day use the Wayback Machine.
Journalists, fact checkers, politicians, policymakers, students.
I think it's a surprise to most people that web pages are as fleeting as they actually.
Oh, it's kind of a cruel joke to call them the page. The average life of a web page is 100 days before it's changed or deleted.
Computer scientist Brewster Kahle created the Wayback Machine in 1996.
There it is.
As part of a nonprofit called the Internet Archive. Its San Francisco headquarters do look the part.
It's a beautiful building, but I mean, it screams your mission. You know, this is the temple of knowledge. Absolutely.
Inside, you'll find the original pews, slightly creepy statues of everyone who's ever worked for the internet, and banks and banks and banks of computers. So is it like, that's a hard drive, that's a hard drive, that's a hard drive, that's a hard drive?
Exactly right. This is about 1/20th of the servers that are one copy of the Internet Archive. And then there are multiple copies to keep it safe.
But Brewster Kahle wants to back up more than just the web. He wants to back up everything.
Can we get all of the published works of humankind available to anybody curious enough to have access to it?
He's backing up.
Okay. So that's the Wayback Machine. They go on to talk about all the other archival work that the Internet Archive does, which is fantastic. Please go check it out. But just to say that the Wayback Machine is not the only web archive in the world. There are many national libraries and archives and universities who have their own initiatives to collect websites related to their own national web space or specific researcher needs, of which the UK has a couple of initiatives, including the work of the UK Web Archive, as well as the National Archives. And broadly speaking, these web archives give us particular windows into the past online. But they are also fundamentally shaping what of the web and its inhabitants will be remembered in future. And this is where most of my research has been positioned. So centered around an interest in what drives web archivists to do this work and how their daily decisions about what to save and how this is done impacts the future or indeed the multiple possible futures of the web. Which brings me to the focus of what I want to talk about today, where I want to propose 3 observations about the ways in which web archiving can be seen as a set of future-making practices. And here I'll just briefly run through them before expanding on each. The first is that the who and the how of web archiving shapes what is saved for the future. Secondly, the existence of web archives and the practice of web archiving actually changes the nature of what the web is. And third, that these practices as an object of study are a place where socio-technical imaginaries for web futures can be empirically observed. So taking each in turn, there's a growing body of research that has illustrated the importance of critically examining how the web is archived and the related implications for scholarship that uses web archives. Rooted in this premise and articulated by Niels Bruegers and others, web archives are not copies of the web, but they're shaped by the doing of web archiving. Here, the socio-technical dynamics of archival practices interact with the cultural dynamics of who does the archiving. So including, for example, selection practices about what gets included or excluded in the archives, as well as the technical artifacts that emerge from the challenges faced by crawling technologies when attempting to archive dynamic sites, for example. All this means that the archives themselves are changed through the process of archiving, where each version may or may not be representative of what was once online at any given time. So in turn, this body of research examining web archiving practices has centered methodological approaches that try to reverse engineer or reconstruct practices through interviews with practitioners, as well as forensic studies of web archives. In addition, ethnographic methods that demonstrate the value of observing practices have been deployed, and certainly I've used them within my own work. But here it's worth noting that much of this research has been framed and justified as a problem for how we will come to study the web and its inhabitants in the future. In other words, we need to know how these archives are being collected in order to reliably understand the web in future. And just to pull out some examples from my previous research, so I did 3 ethnographic case studies with 3 different organizations and groups between 2016 and 2018. The first one with the Internet Archive, so I went out to San Francisco and spent many weeks with them understanding how the Wayback Machine team was working, as well as some of their subscription services that do archival practices as well. In addition, I worked with the Archive Team, which is a kind of hacktivist volunteer group that works online that basically goes around archiving websites online and dropping them in the Internet Archive. But in addition, I worked with the Environmental and Data Governance Initiative, EDGI, which emerged in 2016 in the wake of the election of Donald Trump. So they were particularly concerned about archiving scientific data around climate change and environmental policy, anything that the US government was publishing around environmental policy, as a way to record what the previous administration policies were. And they were extremely fearful, rightfully so, that Donald Trump and his administration would be rolling back a lot of those policies. So they wanted to have good records. Anyway, each of these case studies provided a window into understanding why web archivists do this work and how they were shaping the archives. In addition, I did a National Center for Research Methods placement at the UK Web Archive in 2017, 2018, and published the work at the bottom in 2021 with a colleague who also did a placement at the Danish National Web Archive, where we were thinking about how the web archiving practices, again, were shaping the kinds of questions that social scientists and humanities scholars might be able to ask of these archives in future. And one of the things worth noting about the UK Web Archive, and anybody who's encountered this archive will tell you this, that they're completely inaccessible. Well, not completely, mostly inaccessible, apart from a small selection of their archives, where you have to go to the reading room at the British Library to actually interact with the archives on a terminal, where you're not allowed to document those archives, copy, paste, or bring them home with you. So how a researcher would actually be using these massive data archives in this context is open for question, and Emmanouil knows all about this because he's also had this experience, this very frustrating experience of knowing this data is available, but we cannot have access to it. And if you want to know why, I'm happy to answer questions about that. There's various legal reasons why that is the case, but it provides an interesting context for understanding these practices. In addition, I did a postdoctoral research project under the Social Life of Web Archives project, which was funded by the ESRC. And this was an interdisciplinary collaboration with Sean Walker at Arizona State University and Ed Summers, who's now at Stanford. So they're coming from information science, computer science, engineering, and digital humanities, actually, to think about how we understand the ways in which web archives go beyond the Wayback Machine or indeed their repositories and interact in the kind of world online. So what we really wanted to understand was how could we conceptualize how people are using web archives in the world. So one of the things that we did was using Common Crawl, which is another web archive. So it gets a little meta here. We were using web archives to study web archives here. We wanted to trace the links to the Wayback Machine that were in Common Crawl. Essentially, how were people linking to the Wayback Machine online? So in various social media platforms or in other websites, to understand then the context of why someone might want to do that and how it was being used. So we developed this kind of conceptual framework, and I just pulled out a couple of the concepts here to illustrate. The first concept was around attribution, so how people were using web archives as mechanisms to evidence and cite and attribute online resources to particular actors or points in time. So that will be kind of obvious cases where certainly in a lot of news sites now, they'll be linking to Wayback Machine snapshots so that their content doesn't migrate over time. But in addition, the Wayback Machine and collaborated with the Wikimedia Foundation in a project called the No More 404s project, where they went into Wikipedia and replaced all of the missing links with links to the Wayback Machine. And so when I say that the web archives are changing what the web is, this is one particular example, I think, where you can see it quite illustratively, where a whole bunch, and I'm saying millions of links on Wikipedia are now pointed to the Wayback Machine. So there are big questions about what happens when the Wayback Machine goes away. They'd like to say they will never go away. But they're kind of providing a big a backbone almost to the internet, or to the web. A second concept that we developed was this concept of circumvention. So how people were using links to web archives to circumvent various things online. So that could be to avoid paywalls, for example. So if content is archived within a web archive, then you don't have to pay for it, essentially. And that happens on a lot of news subscription sites, for example. But in addition, we've observed, as along with other scholars cited at the bottom here, the ways in which people were using web archives to circumvent, for example, social media content moderation policies and tools that were being used to scrape or block or indeed delete access to particular types of contents on social media platforms. So, for example, Amelia Acker and colleagues were looking at during the COVID-19 pandemic, how people were sharing misinformation around COVID-19 on Facebook and other platforms, and the ways in which they were kind of circumventing the content moderation policies or the automated tools designed to catch these kind of posts by using links to the Wayback Machine. So moving on, it brings me to this third observation, which is that there are these socio-technical imaginaries for what the web should be or could be built into or observable through the process of looking at web archiving practices. And here I think it's worth pointing to some sources about how I'm thinking about web futures as sites of possibility. And here I draw on a wealth of interest in infrastructure studies from the Science and Technology Studies, or STS field, where scholars frame the significance of infrastructure in everyday life. So that's from bridges, roads, telecoms infrastructure, to databases, social media, and the internet backbone as socio-technical objects of inquiry. And as an example, I really like Megan Finn's work in framing around the ways that infrastructure mitigates futures, how infrastructure is relational, but also how they're both kind of forward and backward facing. And to me, web archives really neatly instantiate this concept where they become the infrastructure for accessing past versions of the web whilst bridging gaps towards some future unknown use. I've also drawn on Apodorai's work on thinking about the materiality of practices, and that's the way that social phenomenon exist at the intersection of human practices and specific material arrangements, for example, through labor or organizations or specific technologies that take a material form. And here Apodorai argues that the imagination becomes an organized field of social practices that I argue ultimately shapes how technologies and infrastructures are imagined, enacted, and made real. And finally, I really draw on Jeffrey Bowker and Susan Lee Starr's scholarship on information infrastructures, where I argue that examining web archiving practices becomes a way of shifting attention towards the unintended, invisible work of imagining alternative webs. So with that, I'm going to pose a couple of imaginaries, if you will, for what the web could be, and what those alternative webs or socio-technical imaginaries might be. So I thought it would be useful to briefly outline a couple in order to demonstrate the value of this approach. And the first socio-technical imaginary I want to propose is present within the web archiving space is that of the global brain. So through my ethnographic research, it's worth flagging that one of the key proponents of this view of what the web could be is Brewster Kahle. So he was featured in the video that we watched earlier. This is the founder of the Internet Archive. And Kahle, in fact, studied for information under Marvin Minsky, who is frequently attributed as the father of AI, and Danny Hillis at MIT, who set up Thinking Machines, which was a prolific early supercomputer manufacturer and AI company in the 1980s in the US, where Kahle developed the connection machine. So the connection machine is in the bottom left here. And I just wanted to pause here to say that the whole project of the connection machine is really fascinating and worth a research project in its own right. But one of the interesting things that they did on the project was to bring in a designer to think about how supercomputers could be thought about in aesthetic ways. So building in kind of design principles into how these supercomputers not only function and at an engineering level, but how they look and feel. So one of the things that they did was put these red lights on the outside of the machine, where every time the machine was accessed or the processor was running, it would flicker with these red lights. And I don't know if you noticed in the video when they went to the Petabox, so that is the servers that are at the Internet Archive featured on the right corner here. But the front of it is featured with blue lights that flicker when everybody accesses the Wayback Machine. So Kahle kind of took this and put it into the server infrastructure at the Internet Archive, which I quite like. So Kahle went on after the connection machine, went on to invent WAIS, which was the Wide Area Information Server, which was the first internet distributed search and document retrieval system. So it was essentially a precursor to the World Wide Web, which they ended up selling to AOL back in the, I guess, 80s, early 90s for a whole lot of money. And then Kahle used that money to start the Internet Archive. So there's a kind of through line here, which I find quite interesting. But thinking about this, returning to this socio-technical imaginary of the global brain, this concept has been seen to be rooted in cybernetics or systems thinking, where the global brain has been defined by others as the distributed intelligence emerging from all human and technological agents as interacting via the internet. So this becomes a kind of futurological vision for an all-encompassing information communications network that connects all people and technologies. The idea is that global interactions and interdependence has created this single superorganism, i.e. an organism, so that's global society, whose components are organisms themselves, that is, individual people. And as the internet becomes faster and smarter and more encompassing, it increasingly interconnects people and computers into a single information processing network, which plays the role of a nervous system for this superorganism. So this is illustrated in the bottom left here. And much of this thinking can be traced back to H.G. Wells' idea of the world brain, and various significant inventors in early pre-hypermedia spaces like Vannevar Bush, Ted Nelson, Douglas Engelbart, where connecting information through amassing and hyperlinking knowledge repositories provides access to all knowledge through information computing technologies. But this is clearly extended by ongoing narratives surrounding the ways in which infinite access to so-called big data also becomes fuel for artificial intelligence. So where AI, in an ideal world, as envisaged by many promoters of AI, frees us humans from the mundane information-centric tasks of everyday life. So where the promise of more data enables more automation, and so on and so on. And it's just worth pointing out that in practice, web archives like Common Crawl and others are regularly assembled for use in machine learning pipelines to generate computational models of text, images, and video for use in a rapidly expanding domain that has, of course, been branded as artificial intelligence. And so the archived web finds its way into models like OpenAI's GPT-3 M4 or libraries like Python's Spacey, that in turn are deployed in a wide variety and ever-expanding number of applications. The point being that web archives are not just sitting in the Wayback Machine in their repositories, they're out there operating in the world to great significance. So one further imaginary is centered around what a decentralized web might look like, where lots of actors within the web archiving space are not just using web archives as mechanisms to shore up the existing web, but are also actively thinking about and developing technologies that use peer-to-peer protocols that more closely resemble the original vision of the World Wide Web as a decentralized network rather than a conglomeration of isolated platforms. So perhaps then it's no surprise that at the Decentralized Web Summit back in 2018, and this continues to be the case, we see Brewster Kahle, Vint Cerf, the so-called father of the internet, and Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the World Wide Web, together advocating for decentralized web development. And here the D-Web is positioned as a form of empowerment in ways that moves away from platform capitalism and the walled gardens of the current web towards one that uses decentralized protocols to provide and enable a form of user control and ownership over their data, the content we put online, and our own online identities. And there's more I could say about this and the problem the field is facing when it comes to the alignment or misalignment of these goals with web archiving practices. And I'm happy to talk about that later if you're interested. So as I've moved towards the end of this talk, I want to zoom out and abstract away from the web archive space to think about what this research might tell us about how we study digital futures in the making. And in the first instance, it's maybe useful to think about what methods we have now for doing this kind of research. Some of those methods I've used within my own research context to look at web archives. In the first instance, I'm thinking about past futures approaches. So those are approaches that look at how past technoscientific futures are envisaged in the past, by whom and to what ends. And there's been various research that have deployed this as well. In my own research, I take a kind of practice theory heavy approach, using ethnographic approaches to think about how we observe futures in the making in real time. So that can be working with engineers or other interdisciplinary scholars as well. We know, and we have lots of scholars actually at the BDFI and in our affiliate network who look at deploying speculative or participatory methods, as well as making alternative futures. As well as design workshops, multisensory experiences to experiment what possible futures there might be in technological development. But I wanted to pose a question here, an open-ended question here around what methodological innovations or new ways of working are needed in this space that go beyond the methods that I've illustrated here. So through this research and going forward, one of the observations that I've made is the challenges of capturing the complexities of socio-technical systems whilst avoiding singular or genius narratives, particularly when we're historicizing what's happened in the past. And I'm certainly guilty of this myself with my focus on Brewster Kahle, who has this very interesting trajectory. But how do we lose something by only focusing on these kind of single linear paths? I want to advocate to branch beyond the usual suspects, and that could be people or particular companies or particular technologies, towards a focus on the everyday, and ways in which we might rope in communities of people and practices and other types of technologies that are often not the focus of our inquiry within this space. And I also want to put a plug towards interventions, that is, identifying where and how interdisciplinary or cross-sector partnerships can meaningfully intervene in digital futures. And what I mean by that is, often as social scientists, we're brought in at the end of these kinds of inquiries. So we've designed the technology. We'd like you to now tell us what the implications of these technologies are. And to be fair, we're pretty good at that to some extent. But what we're trying to do here at the BDFI and beyond is to think about how we have those interdisciplinary conversations at the design stage throughout the process of technology development. So not just at the end. So really brief conclusions. I've used web archiving as a case to talk about my research, of course, but also I think that it gives us a window into thinking about digital features in the making. That emphasizes the fact that particular technologies are not inevitable. They are shaped every day by different types of agendas and actors and technological artifacts. Studying the process of digital features in the making is necessary, but not sufficient. And what I mean by that is that kind of, again, advocating for an interventionist approach. So just seeing what's out there in the world is great, but how do we get involved in developing technologies to a better end? And again, thinking about how we might focus our collective attentions in an interdisciplinary, but also cross-sector partnerships that enable us to do those interventions in digital futures is what I'm really interested in. So thanks very much. And I can take some questions.
Thank you so much for this, super interesting. I think we can open the chat now for questions, right? And I will keep an eye on this. But let me start with the room first, please. Any questions? Please go ahead.
Thank you. That's really interesting and thought-provoking. I remember years ago there used to be a bookmarking service called Delicious, now sadly defunct. And I use a more modern one now called Raindrop. I don't think Raindrop does this, but Delicious used to let you pay extra, and it would keep a HTML or PDF copy of everything you bookmark. My question is, should web archiving be a solely institutional activity, or should more of us be given the opportunity to do our own web archiving, maybe at a team level or a small business level or a personal level?
Yeah, no, really great question. And thank you for reminding me about Delicious. I too used to use Delicious, and then I don't know what happened, if they were bought or they were migrated, but a bunch of their data got deleted, and I suddenly went to look at my things and they were all gone one day. And that obviously that happens quite a lot in this space, which makes web archivists get excited because it means they have a job to do, but then not excited because these things disappear. When it comes to the question of the sort of should aspect of your question, I get a little bit kind of touchy because, and I say this as somebody who studies web archives and has studied it for the last 10 years, the sort of normative dimensions of that question put me on edge a little bit, because there are real pitfalls to the institutional approaches to web archiving, in the sense that a lot of this archiving happens without the consent of people who create this content, who have no say in what happens to this content in the archives, etc. Which are just worth flagging. That said, there's been a lot of emphasis within the field. An archive team is a perfect example of this, where it is a voluntary group that goes out and archives various platforms. So when platforms announce that they're getting bought, or they're going under, or there's going to be some kind of migration activity, often they will swoop in and try and archive all of these things on the behalf of the public, which brings it to all kinds of questions about who's consenting to that. But there have been also personal web archiving initiatives that have been kind of educational in nature to get people to understand the nature of ephemerality and how their content that they give away to user-generated platforms often is not guaranteed in terms of access in the future. And a lot of the tooling development that's happened around the web archiving field has been geared, recent development has been geared towards individual level use of it rather than institutional. So there's a lot of open source tooling that's now available for people to just, browser-based tools where you can archive things on your own accord, put them on your own machine, back them up on your own hard drives, should you wish to. So I think in that sense, there has been a lot of opening up of that space so that it's kind of a non-institutional focus on some of that work and an educational focus on who knows about the fact that their stuff is in danger, and what can you do about it. So that's kind of opened up the space, but I still think there are real questions, as maybe are implicit in your question about the institutional dimensions of how this work happens and who has a say and what happens to their stuff. Hopefully I've answered your question.
These discussions always have some form of nostalgia about
Always.
the great old internet. I love it. Let me take one question from the chat, please. So Anne Singleton asks, what is your advice for researchers and NGOs who are archiving otherwise ephemeral work? Should we focus on preserving the hard copy originals rather than digitizing copies?
So is that in the context of things that aren't born digital?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
This is not my particular area of expertise in terms of digitizing non-digital forms of media, but yes, I think so. And I think if you're a researcher working in a research context, speak to your librarians and archivists as part of your university, because that's a big part of their job, is to ensure that your research data or the outputs of your research interactions are archived for the future, both use by yourself, but also by other researchers. I'm not sure that I've answered the question, but hopefully.
Cool, thanks.
Thanks, Jess. Thanks for the talk. I got a question about towards the end of the slides there, you were talking a bit about the mundane. See, Digital Futures Institute tends to lead us towards, cutting edge, new headline grabbing technologies, but the mundane kind of goes in a slightly opposite direction. So what does that focus on the mundane open up that other type of research where we're kind of going after all the new stuff? What does that do?
Yeah, good question. As you know, Dan, the focus on the mundane is often a thing within science and technology studies, but also within sociology more broadly. The everydayness of our social interactions is often the focus. For me, I think the focus on the mundane brings in to the conversation of technology development and research people who are often excluded from that process of technology development. And I think we're seeing that in some of the work that we're doing at the BDFI, working with our community partners, and thinking not just about the most cutting edge thing, and not that these things should be separate necessarily. They do intersect, and there's a Venn diagram where they intersect, absolutely. But thinking about the mundane ways in which technologies interact with our social world and shape our social world, no matter who we are. And that could be in very different ways. So it feels to me that focus on the mundane brings in, different types of communities, different types of concerns to the mix of the design of technologies that are otherwise often ignored when we're looking at the kind of next great thing.
Let me bring a question from online. Sanya asks, it's your fault you talk about AI. So here is the question. What are the challenges of archiving AI-generated hybrid data, given the volume of data expected to be generated?
Clearly the volume is, as Sanya's already pointed out, that's clearly an issue. The rapid pace in which content is now being created, deployed, and used online is at a pace that I'm certain that web archives are not able to keep up with. But they never were. So my kind of pushback to that is web archives could never keep up with the rate at which and the pace at which content is created online. So it doesn't particularly bother me. I think there are bigger questions about what happens when we as potentially as researchers who go to use, or anyone goes to use these web archives in future. How do we know where this content came from and that it was generated through AI technologies? Like, you know, we don't know how that's operating on the web now. There are big questions about how we understand where this stuff comes from on the web. So once it's taken out of context and put into a web archive, how does that magnify the implications of those unknowns for future researchers? I think are, you know, big unknown questions.
If I may add, how about non-researchers, like
Yeah.
other web archive users, just like the ones we saw in the video, like journalists, fact checkers,
Yeah.
whatever.
I think it's the same though, right? Like if you don't know the provenance of the content that you're examining, and that could be in a close way. So in a close reading of that, I'm using researcher terms now, but if you're a journalist and you're looking at particular pages to verify that this thing happened in the past, which often happens, how do you know that that thing actually was generated by the person that it was, you know, it's been tagged to be generated by? So there are some people working on questions of this within the web archive space. A few years ago, there were, it turned out that the Internet Archive had some security loophole where people could inject content into the Wayback Machine that wasn't real. And they've closed that loophole now, so everybody don't be concerned. But it opened up a conversation about provenance in a way that's not just about a snapshot. So Wayback Machine, it'll tell you this thing was created on this date by this technology. But what more do we need to know, not just as researchers, but as journalists, as politicians, as students, whatever? You know, there are other kinds of provenance questions that have yet to be answered, I think. So, and they will only be magnified by the introduction of AI generated content online, in my view.
Thanks, Jess. I feel like I finally know you and your work better, even though we've seen each other every week for 2 years. I have a question about the ethnographic work that you did, and I'm really curious about the archivists and the people who sort of work there and run those organizations and what they see as their kind of role. And you talked about in terms of the imaginary over there being sort of democratization of access and this sort of public service work in that sense, or even this idea of holding something to account in that sort of Trump example.
Yeah.
But how much did they care about or talk about misuse and appropriation? And I mean, obviously right now it's sort of seems all the more relevant given that that's the sort of infrastructure, the free resource that's kind of producing these new technologies that have huge impact. So
yeah, super cool. Thanks for that question. Yeah, I think you've touched on it really. Like there was a lot of in those ethnographic case studies, there was a lot of focus in different ways in each of them, but I think generally speaking on things like accountability, transparency, democratization, and democracy kind of writ large, that the open access to knowledge mission that the Internet Archive aspires to and that Brewster Kahle aspires to was pretty similar across those other case studies as well. People saw it as a public service, the work that they were doing. A public service for the future, and often with no real use case in mind. The environmental group slightly separate there because they had real clear ideas about what they wanted to use that data for, to further the environmental agenda, really. But the rest of them were very kind of unknown, and when pushed on what they, when I pushed them on thinking about what do you think these things are going to be used for in future, they were very abstract and are really around these kind of headlines around accountability or historians using these in future. Researchers are this kind of big group of people that are absolutely going to use these archives. And I'm here to say that, and Manuel knows this, the field of researchers that use web archives is very small, very, very small. And we're really hoping that we'll be, expanding that field in the near future, but it's still very, very small. But the emphasis that these organizations place on researchers using it is huge, absolutely huge. So there's some real interesting tensions there, and some complex reasons why that is the case, which I'm happy to talk about later. But yeah, it was really difficult to pin them often on what these uses were. Like, there was some other aspect of your question, but I think maybe I.
No, that helps. Yeah.
I have another comment from Hannah Little, which I think I can rephrase it to a question. So, to what extent do you think that a web archiving discussion is different than other, archival discussions regarding other formats, like
Yeah.
non-digital?
Yeah, great question. Great comment and question. Yeah, in some ways it's really similar. So all of my focus on the selection biases of archival practices, like that is completely derived from decades and decades of archival practitioners and researchers saying like the ways in which archives are created and collected really matters for how we use them in the future. So I've more or less just like stolen that idea and applied it to web archives. To me, that's very, very similar. But where they diverge, I think, is in the socio-technical aspects of what web archives are. And in terms of the actual practices that are used to collect web archives, they diverge completely. And that's not to say that archivists and librarians aren't really involved in this space doing web archiving, because they are, as demonstrated by our various initiatives in the national libraries and archives. But there are huge challenges there over the volume, the scale, the technical artifacts that emerge from archiving things. It is not about taking one representative example of an object in the world and putting it in a safe place. This is a very non-representative sample often of what exists in the world. And as I said, it's shaped and changed through the process of archiving, which is often not the case when it comes to analog archival activities. Somewhat less the case with Born Digital in other domains, but there's still different issues apply there.
Yes, please.
An awful lot of information never makes it to the web. So when you're talking about futures, particularly within tech companies, governments, research funding agencies, a lot of that stuff is never makes it out their particular closed garden.
Yeah.
So how do you see your analysis of futures here, interfacing with a whole load of sort of the iceberg below the water, that is where lots of discussions are going on constantly that actually shape a lot of the things that really do happen to us in technology?
Yeah, no, that's a really, really great point. And I think, I think this was always the case, right? So when we're thinking about analog archives, clearly there were, in some of these big industry companies, you would have an archivist who would be responsible for archiving the materials from a particular company to hold them for the future, for future historians, future researchers, future policymakers. I assume that work still happens. I only know it from a kind of historical computing perspective, not from a contemporary perspective. But I think there are still questions about how that work happens within a digital context. So where all of our work is now organized through digital platforms, digital mediums, Born Digital. I assume that work is happening too. I don't know, because that's not the work that I do. But I think that the questions have always been there about how do we understand what's going on in these particular.
I think it would be super useful if you and your colleagues, went out and talked to boards of big tech companies about not letting their archivists and historians be made redundant, and what it is that those people could be doing to really produce, a legacy for everyone.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of it is, I know what went on in the company I was in, and and it wasn't really framed in the way that you're framing things at all. It's curating a very positive, sanitized view of the past.
Of course, yeah.
And I think more enlightened historians probably in companies add a bit of the extra and the tensions and the internal fights, but I don't think they really record it from the point of view of understanding how the technology was shaped.
No, I agree. I would agree with that.
But they could.
Yeah.
I think it would be worth you going out and almost, if you talk about growing the space, I think it's one really important area where if you could get a few of them on board, you could probably get a lot of them on board. And then all of a sudden you'd have a much richer set of information that you'd have access to. because they would start recording lots of really interesting things about internal decision making.
Yeah. No, it's a great suggestion and something I would definitely be interested in following up on.
I'm sorry, just to add to that small point, we did have some conversations, didn't we, about BDFI industrial partners and their archives and things like that.
We did some early conversations and we've spoken to BT is one of our partners, and of course they have the BT archive. There's still questions about what's in that archive, and I think some really interesting questions around the boundaries of what's included in that archive alluded to your point as well. But yes, really interested in taking that further.
I was absolutely fascinated about the use of web archives in developing AI models. I hadn't really thought about that before, even though it seems quite obvious, because they would be really great for developing large language models, for example. I'm curious about your thoughts on the risks of decentralizing the web and web archive practices and how that might relate to decentralized practices of developing AI models.
Yeah, wow. So I don't know much about decentralizing AI model making. That is probably outside of my domain, although I'm interested in what's going on in that space, clearly as it relates to, yeah, this web archive to machine learning pipeline. I think in regards to the intersection of decentralized web technologies and web archiving, a lot of the discussions have been framed around how could we put web archives on the decentralized web, which to me is really fraught with all kinds of ethical dilemmas. You know, speaking about the sort of institutional context in which most web archives are collected and maintained, now we put the same data that has all of these ethical dilemmas in terms of consent and who has access and how do we take things down if they don't want it online anymore, to moving it to a peer-to-peer protocol where those archives are then replicated across the network. To my mind, that just magnifies all of these issues that we have when they're kind of contained within a single institutional space. I don't know what headway they're actually making in building decentralized web technologies in terms of web archivists interacting with those technologies. It was a big thing a couple of years ago, but to what extent it's actually being enacted, I think is open to question. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
That does, yeah.
Happy to talk more about it.
Yeah, yes.
I was just wondering if there was a concern across demographies of the world that is content producing and having their content hosted online, whether there's a kind of a concern with the disparity perhaps with, I don't know whether it would make sense to refer to the demography of the global south. That's probably not an adequate term, but where there's kind of archiving of content that's produced in some parts of the world,
yeah,
or by sectors that are more active in certain parts of the world because they're more interested in certain content, and then a lot of content that's just not being archived because no one's seeing the value in it. And then is there a concern of a sort of epistemic insecurity between the knowledge that's produced?
Absolutely. And there were actually some really early scholars in the web archiving space, so early to mid 2000s, who were pointing out the things that you're pointing out. So this real disparity between who's doing the archiving, what are they archiving, and where are they? And not to mention the language issues. So most of the things that are archived in the Wayback Machine are English-based languages. That's changing a little bit given the ways in which they've distributed to a number of teams to do their archiving work, but it's still the case. So all of the issues around bias and as you're pointing out, the kind of epistemological challenges are really present within the web archiving space. And the map that I presented early on in the presentation of various national initiatives, they're located in the usual places. So absolutely, there's tons and tons and tons of stuff on the web that is not getting archived. And the other day, speaking of this AI question, I was in a workshop where somebody referred to these AI models as being kind of copies of the internet, and it just kind of sent my, it really set me up because these web archives are not copies of the internet. There is no copy of the internet. It does not exist. So like, let's not fool ourselves into thinking that all the things are safely tied up within these institutional spaces or on people's personal hard drives, because they're just not. So yeah, big questions there about what's not getting archived as well.
Can I also ask one big question? Future. I think now we have, it's a kind of a pivotal moment for web archives because of the AI developments, right? So they have been using data from web archives or to train, LLMs. So more publicity has come around these institutions. How do you see the future of web archiving? Do you foresee a continuation of the current mix and match model, which we have coexistence of, I don't know, national archives, independent non-for-profit organizations, and some grassroots organizations? Do you foresee something changing? What do you think?
I mean, in terms of the actual archiving work, not really. Not that I've seen yet. I don't know if there, I mean, that's not to say that it's not happening, but not that I've seen. I don't know to what extent the explosion of generative AI and AI tooling has really changed the web archiving agenda or how they're doing business or who's doing that business. I think the space that everybody's talking about is how researchers might leverage AI tools and machine learning to use web archives in their research. But beyond that intersection, I'm not sure. But it's an interesting question. Most people are talking about the issues that we were talking about earlier in terms of like, how do we discern what's what when we put it in the archive? But it's, to my mind, it's not really shaping how they're doing the work yet. But we'll see.
Any more questions? Here, cookies are waiting for us. So let's thank again Jessica.